Tasha, you want to do the intro, or would you like me to?
Yeah, sure, I can do it. Hey everybody, welcome to our regularly scheduled multi-tenancy working group for Kubernetes meeting. Today we have a pretty packed agenda with some co-chair proposal changes, which everyone should have seen go out on the mailing list. And also Jim and team have some updates on the Kubernetes multi-tenancy docs proposal. We also have an announcement. So I'll just start with the announcements and then I'll hand it over to Jim and team to talk about the docs. So first announcement, the hierarchical namespace controller, HNC 1.0, is now out. Big milestone for the project, super excited for the team. And whoever, if anyone's checking it out, using it, has feedback, please let the team know. We're all watching GitHub issues and chat. So, take it, kick the tires, let folks know what you think, but the 1.0 milestone has been achieved, and really, really big congratulations to Adrian Ludwin and everyone who's worked on it so far. And then the second update is that we are going to be nominating some new co-chairs for the multi-tenancy working group. Sanjeev Rampal is going to move to emeritus status. And we are going to be, we've put together a proposal to move Jim and Adrian and Faye and Ryan into co-chairs. All four folks have been really engaged in the project for probably 3 years at this point, leading various teams. And then Ryan has been our most consistent sort of cross-project contributor, which we really appreciate him for. So I sent out sort of the announcement on the mailing list for this proposal to add new co-chairs, and we will be moving forward with that using lazy consensus. So if anyone wants to reply to the chain with a +1 or feedback, please feel free to do so. If anyone wants to give me any feedback offline, I'm definitely here. But if we don't hear any objections, then we'll be moving everyone into co-chair status at the end of next week on Friday, which is the 15th of April. So those are the two bookkeeping announcements. I do see that someone's in our Slack channel asking for the link for the Zoom meeting. It looks like someone's replied.
I just sent it.
Okay, cool. Thanks, Ryan. What did I say? Always there to reply to the Slack message or pick up the PR. So thanks, Ryan. And yeah, cool. So I think that's all of our bookkeeping for today. And now I'll hand it over to Jim to talk about the docs.
All right. Thanks, Tasha. Okay, let me share my screen, and I'll also add the doc link into chat for those who might not have it. So yeah, a few weeks ago, I think we started, or maybe, I guess it's been, perhaps has been maybe longer than that, a couple of months, we started this effort to propose an update to the Kubernetes docs for multi-tenancy, right? Because one of the key questions we get is, it seems like we have reached, like Tasha mentioned, with HNC and also with other projects, we have reached some level of maturity and knowledge on multi-tenancy, but there's not much, or there's actually no, guidance in the Kubernetes docs around multi-tenancy. So the idea was to propose an update there. So this is a working document which we will convert into a PR hopefully fairly soon. I think we're almost there. We've completed most of the tasks. I think we have a few pending items, and then we can, and even while those are in discussion, we can go ahead and at least create a draft PR and start getting some wider reviews on it. So the idea was for today was to just go through some of the main questions which I had listed in the agenda. And once we're good with those, we can, I feel we can convert to a PR, and there'll always be minor changes. I'm sure we'll get, and hopefully we'll get plenty of other good feedback, and we can continue to iterate. Before we dive into details, does anybody else have any just general thoughts on how this is progressed so far, or where we are? Does everyone kind of share the same feeling that we're in a good spot to start converting to a PR after a few, kind of items have been resolved?
Looks good. I love it.
Yeah, I think it's looking good.
Okay. All right. So yeah, maybe just going down through the list, and I had listed a few things, but feel free to bring up others which you feel are worthy of discussion right now. And of course, things we would there's a few minor things we can continue changing just offline and asynchronously. The first thing I'd kind of listed as on the storage isolation, and I saw Ranjit, thank you for making the updates, and I'll go
Yeah.
through and also reread, but maybe just so that we're all kind of clear, and maybe if you want to kind of just describe what is the guidance here that we want to provide, and if somebody's implementing multi-tenancy, either team-based or the customer-facing multi-tenancy, what do we want to say about storage, or what should we say?
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, cool. So I did make some updates based on your feedback, Jim. So so the way I was thinking about this is that we have this whole or Kubernetes has this whole concept of storage class and persistent volumes and PVCs, right? So the claims that you could attach to a namespace. Um, you know, I, I I thought, so how about we use some of those constructs, and because this whole section we are talking about control plane isolation and how we can use a namespace per tenant strategy. I thought the whole PVC claim per tenant that you could attach to a namespace could be a good story to tell. Um, because you're right, like, I was reading through your comment, you could have an app that is inherently multi-tenant, and you could talk about things like sharding and, other isolation strategy when it comes to storage, but that's not a Kubernetes story, right? So we are, so the thing, what we're doing here is to try to tell that Kubernetes story, and from that angle. So I thought maybe this would be a good topic to talk about. I mean, I would love feedback, obviously, from others and what others think, but that's essentially what I was thinking. So you could take a claim, or you could take a PVC and attach that to a namespace. And if you're following a namespace per tenant strategy, so yeah, so you can assign some dedicated storage for that tenant, right? Or for the workloads or the pods running within that namespace dedicated to a tenant, right? So that's the whole idea. Again,
Right.
yeah.
No, that makes a lot of sense, and I think it's good to outline some best practices. And I recall there were some prior discussions and on this. So it seems like one option could be that if you're running in a multi-tenant environment, you have a storage class per tenant, which prevents any chance of somebody else claiming a PV.
Reclaiming.
Right. The other thing would be the reclaim policy, right? To make sure that it's configured as delete and PVs don't go back into a pool for reuse and things like that. So those two things definitely seem like worth pointing out.
Yeah, I think generally we've recommended a dynamic with a deletion reclaim, right? Is the preferred, and then storage class per namespace is kind of the, if you can't do dynamic PVCs or PVs.
I was looking at the whole storage class per namespace, but I couldn't find good. So are we able to associate a storage class with the namespace?
So there's no built-in construct for it. You would have to use something like OPA Gatekeeper or Kyverno to enforce those type of policies, right? But you would need some way of saying any storage usage in this namespace has to abide or is forced into a storage class.
Gotcha.
But that seems like, yeah, I mean, even, so I guess the question is if someone's using delete, and if we enforce, again, that would have to be enforced somehow, but let's say if they use the reclaim policy of delete, that seems like it's safe enough, right? I mean, there's no, Ryan or anyone else, do you see any other risks with running with multi-tenancy and any chance of misuse of storage?
I mean, obviously, yeah. I mean, under the covers, right? It's a volume mounted to
Right.
a node at some point, so there's risk there. So it's really going to depend on the other policies you have in place to prevent, privilege escalation, host mount path, or host mount paths, and all that other stuff, right?
Right.
So really, it's the storage is kind of only as good as the sum of all the other parts of the security.
So the guidance we're saying is use dynamic storage. Do not use like any host mounts, or even like if you have temp and things like that, you want to make sure that you're not mapping to empty
You want to
host.
try to like limit that though, right? I mean, and that's where it gets hard, because most security auditing tools that people use to leverage a lot of this, like Twistlock, does all of that, right?
Yeah.
And so you have to kind of be mindful that you do have some risk exposure regardless from that perspective.
Right. Well, or even pod security standards with restricted, all of this is prevented, right? So
the thing is, for storage isolation, we using sandbox and not using sandbox has difference. So
true.
Yeah, and realistically, if you're using a dynamic storage, it's going to provision it and attach a PVC immediately. And when the PVC goes away, the rekeying policy will kick off and it will delete it. So the risk of anyone stealing the data between, pod restarts is minimized. But if you're not using dynamic storage, then, or dynamic provisioning, you're exposed. And that's where the storage class come to play. But it's still files on a disk right somewhere. So
Right. Yep, and of course NFS and other things have their own challenges, right? Because
actually I would suggest move the storage and networking isolation part in the runtime part, basically with the sandbox, because they are so different with and without sandbox. And I don't think in this document we are strongly, are we encouraging the sandbox, or we say it is okay if you don't have sandbox?
Yeah, I don't think we've taken a strong stance to say that sandbox is recommended or anything like that. We're saying, I think the reality is, and maybe others have kind of seen use cases also, but a lot of folks, especially SaaS providers, are running without sandbox containers, and they are using namespace-based multi-tenancy. So I think, of course, in team-based, there's other challenges, because now the user has access to Kubernetes APIs, but at least in the SaaS multi-tenancy, just using namespaces seems fairly common.
Yeah. Hey, Jim, this is Jeremy. So sandboxes should really be used if you're going to run untrusted code that you haven't had an opportunity to scan or review. I feel comfortable making that stance.
Okay. So you would say that for storage isolation, sandboxing is not necessarily.
Oh, specifically for storage isolation?
Yeah. So at least storage network isolation shouldn't put into the control plane isolation. So it is data plane thing. So that's my point.
Okay. Yeah, I see what you mean. So I think. Yeah, but let's go back and check the. So you were saying namespace for a tenant. So this section, yes. So the one view is, okay, is this really our storage and networking data plane or control plane? I think here what we're talking about is, if you want a namespace per tenant, what kind of Kubernetes control plane or Kubernetes API constructs can you use to for configuring some storage isolation, right? So yeah, I guess it gets a little bit fuzzy, and I think
yeah. So because if you are talking about like dynamic storages, right? Some host amounts, it's all data plane things. But if you just talk about the PVC object and the PV object, okay, they are control plane things. So either we make it clear, we just talk about any control plane objects in the API server. How do you deal with that? And forget about exactly how that API is implemented by the whatever PV provider, and that's also fine. So maybe we have made it clear. So if we are talking about control plane isolation, networking isolation, we are talking about network control plane object or network, this kind of thing. So make it very specific.
right.
Yeah. Hey, Jim and Fi, this is Dev. Yeah, I agree with you, Fi. Basically, if we limit this discussion in that particular section to PVC and storage classes and then reclaim policy of delete, then it will still fall into what Jim, you were saying about if you want namespace based per tenant, then what all things we need to ensure from storage, network, RBAC point of view. But if we start going down the path of like the data plane isolation, host paths and all of that, then that starts blurring the boundary between what we have in sandboxing and here. So we might want to just restrict this part to PVCs and storage classes.
I see. Yeah, that could work. So maybe renaming this section to something like PVCs and storage classes, or and then adding
And
a
network policy. I think just three very common things.
Yeah, I like that, because that makes it very clear that we're talking about these Kubernetes API resources, and then we can revisit network isolation and storage isolation in the data plane isolation section.
Yeah, something along those lines.
Basically removing the word isolation from here.
Right. Yeah, so just maybe we're saying rename to storage classes, or so I don't know what the Kubernetes docs name it, like PVCs, PVs, but we can follow the same whatever this section is named, like configuring storage or something like that. Okay, and same thing for network isolation. What we're saying is rename to network policy. All right. Yeah, Adrian had the same comment on, I had added this additional security considerations, and he had the same comment on even pod security standards, right? I think the trade-off is, yes, of course, pods, you could say, belong to the data plane, but really we want to make sure if somebody's configuring namespace per tenant, they implement pod security standards and image scanning and CIS benchmarks.
Yeah. Although, Jim, I mean, wouldn't those be, whether it's namespace based or not, I mean, those are more broader
fundamental
things that need to be done no matter what.
Right.
So actually, if we are slightly talking about those 4 sections and transitioning off from that earlier point, then maybe that point you had written in the comments, I thought it was good, where all those 4 and potentially 3 or 4, whatever will end up being, but we move them in advanced isolation or advanced concept, something like a complete separate section where I felt that those are cutting across the board, right? Whether it's multi-customer or multi-team, they are some of these advanced things that cluster admins need to be aware of when they think about multi-tenancy. And then like the last section, additional considerations I had put in that for SaaS providers, but I mean, that is the sort of the bucket that I was thinking is the place where we can, have all these additional things which are not, let's say, so probably quotas are still namespace specific, but API priorities and fairness. Like there is that one mention of if you have logging and monitoring as services which are cutting across the board, then how do you give priorities to the pods so that those get handled with a higher priority, right? So those actually are not specific to namespace per tenant. They can apply to, multi-team, multi-customer, even in probably virtual control plane per tenant. Also, those parts which are for supercluster or API requests which belong to the supercluster, they need to be handled with higher priority, right? So from that angle, I felt that QoS and then DNS was one section that I felt, and Ranjit, you had mentioned in the comments that you were okay to club that with network isolation, and I wanted to hear from others as well if that makes sense. Like when we talk about, now we are going to change the network isolation to just network policies, but if we were to still look at DNS from that particular lens, that it is still applied to part of the networking, right? Like it probably doesn't have to be a separate subsection on its own. What do you all think?
Yeah, so before we jump into DNS, to your earlier point, Dave, so I would like to keep the resource quotas and the limit ranges, the whole quota section under the namespace.
Yeah, I agree with quotas. Yeah. Limit ranges, quotas, those make sense because they are associated with namespace. I'm talking about API priority, quality of service, additional security, and DNS. And I think Jim was also talking about the last four in that list.
Okay.
You see on the screen there, the last four. Yeah, those four. Yeah, quota should remain with namespace.
Okay, that makes sense. All right.
Yeah. The last four is what I was referring to.
Okay. So we're suggesting we move these four into additional considerations, and we remove SaaS providers and just say additional considerations.
That was my, sorry to interrupt, Jim, because I just wanted to make one additional point regarding the additional, like that last section where rather than calling it additional considerations, which I agree with you and Ranjit that people should not think that those are optional.
They're optional.
Yeah, they're optional. That makes perfect sense. So naming the title of that section will still be very important. Advanced isolation is a good title. I'm fine with that if we all agree with that. But then we can also talk about that last point, and we will separately, I'd like to talk about that, Jim, the operators and how they actually is a big concern when we talk with teams, like what operators to use and all. But that can also just fold into that. So it will be a list of like 5 things and maybe something else that doesn't fit in the neatly fits into these other sections. We can still use that additional advanced isolation section to discuss and outline these things, because we want to be comprehensive without missing anything which all of us have seen in the field, and it will be good for us to just capture it in some place.
Sure. Okay.
Yeah, so let me stop and we can continue with the earlier flow. I didn't mean to interrupt, Jim.
No worries. I think this is a good segue into that topic itself. So yeah, if we move these down, we rename this into and I even advanced seems, that it could be considered that if somebody just wants basic isolation, they can skip that, but then stuff like we're saying that, in the security settings, we want folks to consider. So we could say like common considerations or things like that, right? Or we'll find some proper name for it. The other option is we move some of that into key concepts, right? We could move security into key concepts so that it gets prominence there, even before talking about control plane and data plane isolation.
So actually, that's a good point, Jim. And now the main problem with that, I think with that will be, it's just too much of details before building up the whole story. Right now, the way it is
Right.
flowing, it's just like use cases, very high level, then key concepts, okay, everyone
Right.
understands them, then, okay, now you are driving into details, and then these are like really additional details. So
Right.
that can just go,
Yeah.
yeah, we don't want people to,
I would,
skip that.
yeah, I agree for the other sections like QoS, etc. I feel security may need that emphasis upfront.
Oh, you're saying just that particular subsection.
Correct.
Okay,
Correct.
okay. Yeah, probably you are right, because those image scanning and those things are
It's fairly,
those are concepts. Yeah, I think I agree with you. We can move that particular part in the key concept section.
okay. All right. So that, I think, from the organization perspective should help, right? So just
Yeah.
going back and recapping what we just said. So we'll move security up and we'll just call it security under key concepts. In control plane isolation, we'll call this network policy. We'll call this PVCs, PV, something related to the control plane, the API objects. Then under data plane isolation, we'll move storage isolation. If there's, and there I guess the question is, what else do we want to say about storage then? So again, we could revisit sandboxing, but we have covered sandboxing and node isolation here.
Yeah, I think Ryan, it was you, Ryan. You were mentioning about this, talking about storage,
host, right? Host volumes and things. Okay, yeah, so we could call that out.
I think, Ryan, you should just take a look at the part which is there currently in sandboxing, and then what additional things you think should go as part of data plane storage isolation.
Sure. Yeah, I'll take a look.
Okay. And network, I don't know if there's anything else to be said about isolating networks from the data plane perspective, but DNS, I guess, could, where would DNS go? Under.
Yeah, so what do you all think? Like, should DNS be its own subsection, or can we fold it as part of network isolation? I mean, whatever we want to call like the network segregation, not segregation, we are not using that word. But
so we are going to change that to network policy. So in that case, I don't know if DNS adding DNS makes sense.
Yeah, exactly. Now that's what I was thinking, because we decided to rename that. It is probably a different issue now.
Okay.
I mean, it can stand on its own.
I think it can stand on its own.
Okay. All right. Sounds good. Okay, so I'll make those changes, at least the structural changes to the doc, and send out a note. I think all of that's good.
So there's just one thing I sort of purposely stayed away from is bringing in service mesh when writing the network isolation part, because that can open up a can of worms, right? So I don't know, just wanted to get the thoughts from the group here. Is that worth bringing in, or just keep that?
I mean, I don't think it fundamentally changes anything, because you still have network policies, right? And the service mesh has their own flavor of a network policy, but
no, but actually, I'd like to hear, Ranjit, what sort of specific problems have you encountered, in the sense that what Ryan is saying, yeah, from the technology point of view, that is true. Service meshes will have their own network policies and whatnot. But when it comes to configuring a cluster for multi-tenancy, what were like, there is something that you were thinking that is a problem, right? That's why you, so I'll be happy to actually hear what you have in mind there.
Well, yeah, no, I've heard some customers I've spoken to, especially the ones that are building a SaaS multi-tenant environment, bring in a service mesh to control, restrict traffic more at the infrastructure layer, right? And it's something that always comes up, but I wasn't sure if that was the focus of this document, or do we even bring
no,
that
actually,
up?
because you mentioned that, I'm reminded of something which I wanted to bring up to the group and also specifically ask Jim. Is see, OPA and Kyverno, they are good sort of building blocks or tools that can also help with some of these restrictions. And there is a passing reference to policy engines in the doc. So separately from service meshes, what should we even, the first question is, should we not actually bring those, at least passing references to those tools in here? And how do they help with multi-tenancy configuration? Like if there is some guidance, because ultimately cluster admins, if they know that, okay, I can use OPA or Kyverno, that's a good thing for them, right? Like to be comprehensive.
All right. Yeah, so let's answer the service mesh question first, and then we can discuss policy engines as well. So I think, again, if we are creating like an other considerations or, an other sort of section, it's fair to reference service mesh there and say that can be used for network policies. I think I don't know then whether we have to go into details like, okay, some service meshes operate at layer 7 versus layer 4.
Right.
That creates other,
Exactly.
complications to explain. And if we're putting this in the Kubernetes docs, I mean, the more we stay close to the Kubernetes API, the better, right? Because, there could be perhaps other higher level docs which explain, other things, right? So I think and obviously even with service mesh, there's things like network service mesh, and then Cilium operates with eBPF. So
correct.
there's so many different implementations.
Yeah, and
We
flavors.
won't be able to do that justice.
Yeah, I agree.
But we could briefly mention it and say service meshes can be used, and different service meshes may operate at different layers of the network, the OSI stack, right? And leave it at
I like that idea. So briefly mention that in the other considerations.
In the other considerations section.
Okay.
Right. Yeah, and if you do that, then we could give the same treatment to policy engines, right? To say, hey, policy engines can be used to restrict and manage configurations per namespace or per tenant, but different engines will have different ways of doing things, so mileage may vary, right?
I guess the only suggestion I'd say is maybe we could even make it more generic in saying, admission and mutating webhooks can be used to enforce, and there are various tools that make it easy,
right?
Because I know quite a few people that just write their own admission webhooks, right? And skip it altogether. So
yeah, I mean, that's fair. So in fact, looks like Adrian is not here today, right? Because I had asked him to also write a blurb on HNC, which can also go in that section. So basically, that's our section where we have all these. I mean, for lack of better word, I'm just calling those as advanced concepts, but they are in some way they are advanced concepts, right? Not everyone will need those. At the same time, they are important. So
right. So for tools though, like projects and tools, we can have just a separate section, and we can move this towards the end, and we'll have to check. I know so some other documents, I have not seen this in the core Kubernetes docs, but other docs do include like a section where any project can kind of add themselves, and there's a disclaimer about third-party projects, things like that. So we can follow those guidelines and just have a section on projects with links to CAPI nested, HNC, and then any third-party tools like vCluster, Capsule, CloudArk, that want to be listed. But we'll have to check on what the allowed guidelines are, and how to do this, where things can be listed, but it's not, there's no sort of, the goal here is to educate and not to sort of advertise projects or, prefer one project over the other, right?
So I think I've seen that network CNI implementations, and
Correct.
I think even CSI has those, right? So,
Right. So we can follow the same guidelines and have a separate section for that. Yeah.
So
Okay.
then, just I know we are sort of towards the end, but Jim, I wanted to ask or discuss with the group, and because we had the specific question, the last point there.
Right.
Yeah. So let me share with the group what that point is about and where it's. So see, when all of us understand what operators are and controllers are, and what we have when we talk with customers seen is invariably there is some operator, one or two in fact, sometimes more than two in their clusters, and they are trying to give a SaaS where operator is just part of the story. So for example, let's say it's a WordPress as a service and the database might be MySQL might be coming from a MySQL operator. That's a very typical example. And there are such containerized applications that we are seeing more and more every day now, where the storage is being managed by the operator and the application has its own, it may or may not have an operator. So from a cluster admin's point of view, the trouble that they seem to face is, okay, I have all these MySQL operators out there, some are open source, some are proprietary, but how do I know which one is best from my needs of creating a SaaS? And from that, when we started working with such teams, we realized that there are some basic things that an operator needs to support. And those are the 5 things that I have listed out there. And I won't go into the details of those. And as I mentioned in the comment, Jim, I will shorten that, but I wanted to wait for this discussion to happen before I take a stab at that. But the main point was, if we bring that out as well, then it just helps a cluster admin that when they are choosing operators, and I agree with your point where we ultimately the operators are for providing some service, and the question comes, I mean, SaaS model is where this becomes more relevant. How should an operator be? Now, we are not going to guide them on operator development. That's not this document is meant for. But as a cluster admin, when they have to choose existing operators from, let's say, a marketplace or even some operator repository, they can use this guidance to check which operator will satisfy their needs. So that's the background, and then the team, you all can read up on that. But that was what my thoughts were, that if we are having a separate section for like advanced concepts, advanced isolation, then we can put this discussion as part of it.
Right. No, thank you. That helps explain and frame, the, I guess, what needs to, or what's described here. I guess on my first reading, and maybe this was based on the prior versions, which you're waiting to update, but this seemed very much focused on operator authors. So if we can flip that and say, okay, what should an operator admin care about? Then and how do they evaluate if that operator is fit for multi-tenancy? Then that makes
in fact, it's not. I see that that's the sentence which can mislead.
Right.
It's written, and I have written that, but it's in the like a while back. So but I will shorten this if you are okay. And I mean, if the team feels that this is part of that kind of the document that we are creating, this will add value, then definitely I will work on it to shorten.
So my related question though was, is this guidance for operators specifically, or should we generalize it for any shared service, right? So is there something, sort of unique or specific that and of course we can in that section, we can talk about, operators also, but
So
whether
see,
the service is installed or managed by an operator, or it's managed manually or through Terraform or
Well, I
whatever,
think,
does it matter?
I mean, I think it does because CRDs are cluster wide, and a shared service, if it's not using custom CRDs, then it's kind of by default has to be namespace in some regard, right? And so then you have namespace isolation if you're following everything else. But from an operator perspective, it largely has to be cluster wide. So I guess you could just say cluster scoped services.
I guess
So
that was my
actually,
assumption of what a shared service would be, but maybe that's not a valid
no,
use of the
so
term.
let me ask you, Jim. I mean, I roughly understand what you are implying, but I had a very specific guidance as part of this section. So if we, to answer your question, if we see, ultimately we want to provide a concrete guidance, and when it comes to an operator is the vehicle or the mechanism through which a service gets created or is enabled in the cluster, right? You have a operator, and from them, based on that, you can create WordPress services. So, but when it comes to concrete guidance, it's not about the service, the guidance that we will be able to give, but it will be, the guidance will need to be for the specific implementation. So if you are using a MySQL operator as part of, let's say, a WordPress service, then that MySQL operator needs to do 1, 2, 3, or need to have these things 1, 2, 3, 4, whatever. So I think when I rewrite this, I will give that context to the discussion, that from where the operators or what roles an operator play as part of a shared service, and then the specific guidance that we recommend, that kind of structure that we are liking, right? So I will rewrite this in that flavor where the guidance is very specific. Like if you are using a MySQL operator, for example, make sure that that controller or the CRD spec has certain things defined, so that your, like for example, guaranteed scheduling, you need to make sure that there are the resource request time limits defined. Otherwise, Kubernetes will bump out your pod, and that can just crash your WordPress service. I mean, that
Sure.
particular instance of the service.
Yeah. So, but even in that example, I guess the question I have is, so of course, one best practice is that you have a operator which is automating the configuration and lifecycle management of that service. But what you just said about configuring, like, whether it's resource limits or other best practices, even if in some case somebody is manually configuring a MySQL instance, wouldn't they want to follow the same guidelines?
You are saying from that angle, I mean, without even an operator.
Yes, because as an admin, these are just, I'm providing this as a service.
Yeah, but that's true. That's actually a very valid point and valid question. But because we have already sort of talked about those things as part of, let's say, the namespace isolation, where if you have, as a cluster admin, if you have control over the traffic, let's say through policy engine or something, to apply those policies no matter what, then yes, and that point has been covered. But I'm specifically now referring to the situation where a control plane is getting extended, right? All these control, an operator will add a new API, and that API is not going to expose pods or anything. It will be a very high level abstraction, and behind the scene, the control is going to create whatever resources that it wants, or as part of handling that CRUD operation on that new API. So now the question is, what should we look at? I mean, as a cluster admin, what should I look at when I see two competing MySQL operators which I want to install in my cluster? And the guidance will be specifically around that point, where we will tell them that, okay, look at some of these things that your controller is doing. It might require them to analyze the operator's code, just look at eyeball it if it's
Okay.
possible, just look at spec and all of that. So this section will definitely shrink, but that's where I felt that we might be able to handhold some of the decisions for them,
Yeah, and I think, I guess to Jim's point, I think all of the same recommendations we would make for an operator probably apply to any shared service on the cluster, or any, I'd say any service that has a cluster role, right? It's going to be roughly a lot of the same guidance.
Is it everything we put in control plane isolation, or for workloads?
I don't think we have everything in there. I mean, see, and Ryan, I understand that. Still the question is, they are not the same thing, right? Like when I add a new, yes, broadly it is all control plane isolation, but now we are talking about control planes that are written by third party, whereas control planes and control
No, yeah, but I'm
objects,
saying
yeah.
any shared service, right? Like that's not necessarily an operator, right? Because I guess, I mean, technically I don't know if I would consider Kyverno an operator, but it's essentially implementing, CRDs that have reconcilers that are cluster wide, right? So like, I mean, I guess it's a shared service versus,
yeah, but actually that you make an absolutely great point. And when we were working on the operator white paper, that like what to call an operator was a hotly debated
Sure.
discussion point. So yes, Kyverno these days, and as we have heard Tim and everyone talk about, everything will be a custom resource eventually. Everything is moving in that direction. And Kyverno, everyone has their own custom resources, right? What I'm specifically concerned about, and this is again coming from the discussions in the field, is there are certain operators which are more just for the lack of better term, we can call them stateful services, let's say. Like at Cassandra, DataStax as their operator, and we have worked with so many people, Elastic, and of course MySQL we have studied. They have very specific role, right? They define a custom resource whose sole intention is to provide a high-level abstraction to create instances of that underlying service. And it's not a service which is going to be used across the board, like let's say, or across the cluster like Kyverno, but it will be an instance of MySQL which will be used as part of a particular application stack. It could be whatever the application you are using. So I'm talking about those kind of operators which cluster admins have to choose no matter what, especially in a SaaS kind of setup. That becomes a key sort of time sink.
Right. I guess, yeah. I'm still not sure what guidance would be different from that sort of situation than a Kyverno type situation where it's just a CRD with a cluster role that can do a lot of things on the thing. It's a shared service, right? It's shared across the cluster. So I guess maybe some verbiage around a shared service or an operator per namespace, right? Like that could be.
No, let me just answer that particular point, Ryan. The difference between Kyverno and a MySQL operator is Kyverno is not going to create new pods, right?
It can. It has the add option, right? It has features to potentially do that, right? So there's a lot of security concerns around Kyverno and that from that same regard, right?
No, but is like Kyverno or OPA's main role is not that, right? As against that, the main role of a MySQL operator is to actually create behind the scene the entire like whatever is needed to run a MySQL as a instance in the Kubernetes. So the difference I feel between something like even a service mesh has their own CRDs, right? So if we take a broad brush and not call this out, I feel that we will miss out on providing a good guidance there, because they are not the same things. Like just saying that, yeah, all the cluster wide services need to have all these things anyway. So, we won't be able to finally tell our readers that what
Right.
specifically need to be looked at when they are choosing something like operator for a shared storage service. I mean, not shared, but a storage kind of service.
Yeah, I think that the recommendation here is actually highlight the thing that we have discussed in previous documents. So is that okay to say, if we write an operator in a multi-tenancy scenario, how about we trying to automate the thing that we have discussed? For example, we can, that guaranteed scheduling, is it possible for this operator to have people like saying, have a webhook, so to automatically patching all the requests for the parts that the customer that requires, basically make everything that you list as a automation for the operator. So for example, the operator can automatically set up the network policy for the tenants. I would say that kind of thing makes a little bit more, I would say, just like a recommendation, not enforce everything that you have mentioned, because the thing that I mentioned is kind of specific to a particular use case that
yeah, and that's what I had originally called out, that these are the recommendations coming from the field for the SaaS kind of use case, not the multi-team. We haven't seen so much. Probably they might arise in that scenario as well. So see, I'm not suggesting, first of all, I'll be rewriting this. The main point is, to answer your question, yeah, like some of these things can be automated. Yes, and to answer Ryan's question, those can apply across the board for every service out there. The main point is, today in the field, what's happening is there are operators which are doing certain things, right? And for cluster admins, we are not recommending or telling them how to automate things. We are helping them choose one operator or another based on certain criteria that they can easily check to just maintain their multi-tenancy posture. Of course, all of these things can be done through OPA, probably Kyverno can do it. We have an admission controller as part of 2+, which does many of these things. Yeah, we don't actually mention those, how to automate them here, because it is mostly about, look, you are these third-party controllers that you are adding to the cluster, and they need to follow certain things. That's the whole point.
Okay.
Yeah, my worry is for existing operators. So if we write this way, are we saying that all the existing operators, they are not multi-tenancy ready? Maybe it is, they are, but I just don't want to deliver that message.
No, I'm not saying, no. So fine, that's a very good point. I'm not declaring any operator here to be multi-tenancy ready or not. These are just the criteria that cluster admins can keep in their back pocket as part of their evaluation when they have to choose an operator for something. I don't know. And for this particular discussion, I'm not going to call out Kyverno as a operator from that perspective, because it's more an admission controller which is doing the policy engine. But something like MySQL or so many other services, right? Mongo, etc. So yeah, none of the operators are multi-tenancy ready or not ready. We cannot, as a team, we cannot make that decision. I'm just saying that we can help cluster admins with some criteria or guidance on what to look for when they have to choose certain operators as part of their control plane and add new things from third-party repositories into their clusters. That's all the main point is.
So why don't we do this? I know we're almost at time. So, Devdatta, if you want to rewrite this section from the cluster admin perspective, we can give it another read. I do feel that if we're specifically talking about operators, we may need to add something just about other types of shared services, which are not, namespaced or not creating an instance per tenant. So that way it may flow a little bit better to say that as a cluster admin, you're going to be configuring some required services like DNS. There's optional shared services, perhaps like OPA, Gatekeeper, or Kyverno. There's other operators you might configure for per tenant services, right? And we can cover all three and provide some guidance, some high-level guidance on how to go about selecting or evaluating these services and what they want to put into their cluster.
Yeah, I mean, I'll take a stab at rewriting this from the cluster admin's perspective. I'm not still 100% convinced that we need to club Kyverno, OPA, and third-party services along with these operators.
I'm not suggesting we do.
Yeah.
I'm saying we if we're talking about operators, it seems like we should also mention something about other shared services which are non-operator, not driven through operators, right? Because there are several examples like Valero, right? So if I want to install Valero, is it multi-tenant? Is it not? There might not be an operator for it, right?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And yeah, I mean, that's the reason we are having a separate section where we can definitely, again, probably shared services can have its own subsection. I'll try to, the reason I'm resisting that particular point is because what's going to happen, is the guidance that we have learned that is more specific to the operators that we have seen and work with in the field, and something like the question that you raised are valid questions like Valero, is it multi-tenancy like ready or not? Honestly, I won't be able to tell you right now because I haven't studied that, or even how the guidance that I'm going to give later on, how that relates to Kyverno, I won't be able to be confident about that. So rather than diluting the whole message, maybe what we can do is we can have, anyway, we are going to have a separate section of advanced isolation, right? So we can have shared services like Kyverno, Valero, and then maybe you can take a stab at writing about those. And this can be very specific section that, let me first take a stab at that, writing it, and I'll do that later today. And then we can go from there.
All right, yeah, let's kind of review once you have that covered. And I am also agreeing with you that the shared services would be a separate section, right? Not combined with the operator section, but seems like
I like that.
You call that out.
Correct. Right. We want to be comprehensive no matter what. So I agree with you.
All right.
All right.
So I know we're a little bit over time, but great discussion. And I think, again, I feel we're pretty close to getting this PR ready. So it's exciting to see it come along.
Jim, just one last point. The Zoom link that I used from our main document, is this not that Zoom link? I think because nobody was there on that particular
this is
Zoom
the
meeting.
Link. Could you DM me on Slack wherever you found that other Zoom link, and I'll try and update it?
Yeah, I will. It was in our main doc.
I which doc you're referring to. So if you could just send me.
Absolutely, I can do.
Thanks, buddy.
Thanks.
All right. Thanks. Bye-bye.
Thanks.